revelation.
You can't handle the truth.
Hey everyone, it is Thursday, May 1st. May 1st, the day of the communists, May Day. So we're going to get into the news in just a minute. There are a lot of mixed signals out there for investors and other people involved in the market. But if you're a Trump supporter, you're going to hold tight because we're going through some restructuring and we're going to turn this ship of state around. So let's get into the news for today, Thursday, March 1st. We're going to start out with Reuters. Fed signals rates will remain unchanged despite market bets on looming cuts. Well, that's not what we've been hearing. But the Fed and Jerome Powell are planning to do everything within their power to undermine the Trump administration's efforts to restructure global trade and the American economy. Going back to the article, Fed's concern is above target inflation that may worsen due to tariffs. Now, I talked about this yesterday. Tariffs don't cause inflation. Now, the people at the Fed are financial wizards of sorts, economic wizards. They know this. So Reuters, MI6, and the United States Federal Reserve, which is a consortium of global banks, are doing what they always do, which they're misleading people. Tariffs don't cause inflation. Can tariffs raise prices? Yes, but that's not a given. That's speculative. Article goes on to say the Federal Reserve policymakers have signaled that a short-term interest rates will remain unchanged as they wait for clear signs that inflation is nearing the U.S. Central Bank's 2% goal or until there is a whiff of deteriorating job market. All of this has already happened. So the latest inflation number was down. It's 2.4. I predict that it will be close to 2%. Probably not under. I would say 2.1 or 2 at the next inflation report, which is coming out soon. And the Federal Reserve will be forced to make a decision. It will be above 2%. It'll be 2 or above 2%. And so will they cut rates or won't they? The article I read, this very same article I read from Reuters not long ago said that it was very likely that the Fed was going to reduce interest rates by a full point in June. Well, that is, if my prediction is correct, that is exactly what's going to happen because they're going to have to wait to the middle of this month to get the inflation report. But now the Reuters story is saying, well, no, that's not, the Fed is going to keep rates unchanged. Doesn't the U.S. Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, isn't it concerned with helping Trump and his agenda, his economic agenda? Well, obviously they're not. They're antagonistic toward it. The next Reuters article, and now the Reuters is, as you can see here from the screen, Reuters is trying to get me to subscribe. And Reuters articles were free online forever. And now they want me to subscribe to certain stories. And this one, why is it important? U.S. consumer spending surges in March, inflation cools. And if we could have gone into the story, what it says is because people are worried about the effects of tariffs, they're stocking up on goods that may be affected. I'm going to do the same as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you're worried about the United States, the economy of the United States, and you live in the United States, you should at least partially increase your consumer spending. That helps the economy. The economy, the U.S. consumer market is the strongest in the world. The Reuters article also says that inflation cools. It is continuing to cool, and the article suggested, as I hinted at, is that the inflation, the last number was 2.4, which was down considerably or marginally. It's going to continue to go down. Bear with me here. So realistically here, looking at the economy, it's mixed. The market is mixed. The indicators are mixed, but remember, we're going through a severe transition. I have to move something around here. Can't even find the story now. Sorry about this, folks. I thought I was fully prepared, and of course, when you think you're prepared, something else comes up. All right, let's go to this article because it's pertinent here. From Just the News, calls coming from Congress for Pentagon to pass audit as Trump eyes bigger military budget. And the reason this is important is because there are two things. Military spending is very important in the overall economic picture because that money trickles down into the general economy. However, even though Pete Hegseth said he was waiting for Musk and Doge to get into the Pentagon for another audit, all of a sudden, that's fallen off the radar. What happened? Now, Congress is calling for an audit before they okay new spending. Congress wants the Pentagon to be able to fully account for its spending by 2028, something the department hasn't been able to do despite years of work. Financial transparency is critical for the military. U.S. Representative Pete Sessions, Republican of Texas, said it is critical for the American public to know what they have confidence that is being well managed. The cost, obviously. One of the biggest areas of fraud, waste, and abuse is military spending. So to hang your hat, Elon Musk, on, we saved $150 billion. Okay, I'm going home now. And you haven't even gone into the Pentagon. Now, some of this stuff is classified, so I think that's where they ran into issues. So I want to move just quickly here to what everybody in the media has been talking about for some time. This is from the Washington Examiner. How liberals mislead about deportations to legitimize them. Liberal media and Democratic politicians are purposely misleading people about deportations. More specifically, they are trying to manipulate voters emotionally by leaving out key details about the people being deported or the circumstances of their deportations. Indeed, I proved that recently with the Tom Homan appearance on Face the Nation, which he said, we don't deport citizen children, because that's what the Democrats and the mainstream media was alluding to, that these children were deported, which they weren't, without due process, which they don't deserve because they're children. And, of course, as I often mention, is that they say these people don't have due process. They do. If they were processed when they came into the country, they have a court date. Most illegal immigrants skip their court date because they don't want to be deported. And that was their due process. If they skip their due process, they go to jail, directly to jail, do not pass go. So the article goes on to say that they do this, and this is because they view almost all deportations as illegitimate. They don't believe people should be deported or that we should have a border policy. This has been most prevalent in the coverage of the Maryland man Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Obviously, Abrego Garcia had been painted as a Maryland father who was mistakenly deported, with the goal of such coverage being to convince people that he was legally living in Maryland, which he wasn't, and should never have been deported. Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland, called the deportation illegal abduction. It certainly wasn't. And we're going to get into some other stories about because there was some issue whether or not that these people should or shouldn't be in El Salvador in prison. And I'm just going to say here that it is illegal in El Salvador to be part of a gang, particularly MS-13. So anybody who's a member of MS-13 goes to jail. That was the law that brought law and order back to El Salvador. And the liberals like Jessica Tarloff on the 5 say, oh, he's the right's most favorite dictator, or Central America's favorite dictator, or whatever. And all the law-abiding citizens in El Salvador love him because now you can conduct yourself freely within El Salvador without having fear of being shaken down by the gangs. All right, and this was most illustrated. PJ Media has a story on the 5. Yesterday, Jesse Waters humiliates Jessica Tarloff in heated debate over MS-13 gang member. Now, I have to say a couple of things here. First, I'd like you to engage the channel, like, subscribe, leave a comment, share the podcast. Also, I was watching the 5 last night, and I said this before Jesse Waters chimed in, which he always slam dunks Jessica Tarloff. I said the same thing, is she was lying. She was just talking out of her ass. She doesn't know. And it was specifically when she referenced that these people had committed no crime and they were in this El Salvadoran prison. But if he's a gang member, MS-13 gang member, you go to jail. It's your affiliation that's illegal. So that dissuaded people from joining the gang, obviously, and then it put all the gang, they didn't have to wait for a gang member to commit a crime or whatever. They would just have to prove they were with MS-13, usually through tattoos, and then they'd go to prison. So Jessica Tarloff opened by suggesting that the trip by Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen to El Salvador had shifted public opinion in the controversial case of Abrego Garcia. Actually, it hadn't. And the reason being is because, again, like most Democrats and pundits, liberal pundits on the news media, it hadn't shifted opinion. The only people's opinion which had been shifted were the ones that believed what these people were saying, which just wasn't true. That this guy was just a guy. He was a citizen or here legally or a Maryland dad that had been taken by the Trump administration and flown to a prison in El Salvador. First of all, it's not the case. And most people's opinion hadn't shifted because the majority of Americans don't want illegal immigrants here in the country. They want them all to be deported. And particularly if they're have gang affiliations, and even more so if they've committed crime, but not just on that basis. By a 2-1 margin, she said, and this is Jessica Tarla, people think that Abrego Garcia should have been returned to the United States. No, that's not true. She said, referencing polling data. And again, polling data has to be looked at very suspect. Tarlov argued that while many assumed Trump's remarks about gang tattoos were hyperbole, his exchange with ABC's Terry Moran suggested otherwise. It seems like Trump actually did think that. No, because if you look at the tattoo on the knuckles, it represents MS-13, but it's in a veiled way. So people within MS-13 know what it meant. And as Jesse Waters then pointed out, that gang experts in law enforcement said he was with MS-13. So who are you going to believe, Jessica Tarlov or law enforcement? So it goes on to say Tarlov pivoted to defending migrant mothers who were deported with their children, and we went over this, claiming falsely that due process was denied. One of them had 2 minutes on the phone to talk to her husband to try to figure out what would happen to her American child. It's not an American child. It's a citizen. I wouldn't call it an American child. She said, you should be able to talk to your lawyer before you're deported, especially with your American citizen. No, as I explained previously, you have your due process. You can self-deport. There are a lot of things you could do if you know you're here in the country illegally. Maybe you should talk to your lawyer before ICE shows up at your doorstep. And even then, if you're in the country illegally and there's no discrepancy, there's no doubt that that's the case, illegal immigrants don't get full court. The due process is due process, is a hearing that they were scheduled to that most people blow off. But then Jesse Waters' retort was, I'm sorry, Jessica, I love you, but I don't believe anything you say anymore. And that's exactly what I said, is that she's lying. You're wrong about everything. So he echoed exactly what I was saying. First, he's a Maryland dad. Then he actually does have tattoos that spell out MS-13. Then he was working at Home Depot, he said mockingly, and then and then there was this other tattoo expert that you have. I thought you were supposed to trust the experts, right? And all these experts say the guy's a gangbanger, and you don't trust the experts. Use your brain, Jessica. He went on to say the exchange ended with Waters laying out the legal reality of child deportation cases. When you pick up an illegal and they happen to have their kid with them, they get a choice. You want to be deported with your child or assign a family member or guardian in the U.S. If you don't like the law, then go to Congress and change the law. That's what I always say about people that are scofflaws. You just don't get to break it because you say the law is unfair. Go change the law. And the fact is, she didn't have any acquaintances or relatives, and the father wasn't, that is an American citizen. He went on to say, otherwise, you just get women here breaking through the border, having babies, and they all get to stay because you feel bad about the babies. And then the Wall Street Journal has been on a tear lately of really just printing falsehoods. He's held in an El Salvador's mega prison without any criminal charges. Carlos Esegadugui. Legal journey to the U.S. put the Venezuelan on a collision course with an unprecedented deportation plan. Again, it's illegal to be affiliated with a gang in El Salvador. So that's the crime. Go look it up, Wall Street Journal. If you're a gang member and you're in El Salvador, you go to prison. And most people with MS-13 are proud to be with the gang, and so they either have gang-affiliated tattoos or they just admit it. So we'll see. And if they're in the country illegally, I don't care where they're deported to. I don't feel bad. They shouldn't have come here in the first place. And to be honest with you, I like immigrants. I like people to come here legally. And I hate to say this, but I even have some consideration towards granting amnesty. But as I always said, there should be a moratorium on immigration before that happens, and the border has to be closed before that happens, because as soon as you grant amnesty, that's going to give a green light to everybody who wants to come to this country and think they're going to get amnesty. And there has to be certain conditions. Obviously, you have to live here for a long time. You have to prove tax receipts that you've been contributing to this country, obviously without any criminal violation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we have more to worry about with illegal immigration. The Federalist is reporting non-citizen voting and voter fraud schemes. DOJ investigates voting crimes across multiple states and elections. Justice Department charged multiple individuals with illegally voting as non-citizens in American elections. The DOJ also revealed a foreign national pleaded guilty to conspiring in a voter registration fraud scheme for people who were in the country illegally. 45-year-old Akil Abdul Jamil was charged with illegally voting in the 2020 elections. Jamil, an Iraqi, allegedly voted in the 2020 election in Saratoga County, New York, despite not being a citizen. The U.S. Department of Government Efficiency contributed to the investigation. Some 1,200 miles south, 32-year-old Uzbekistan national Sanjar Jumalov pleaded guilty to conspiring to submit fraudulent voter registration. And then from One American News, 2 Ukrainian nationals hit with federal charges after illegally voting in the 2024 presidential election. 2 Ukrainian women in South Florida on temporary visas were hit with federal charges after being accused of illegally voting in the last 2024 U.S. presidential election. No surprise there. You know, before I go on to that, I have to say this again and again. People that illegally vote, it's not a novelty for them. People that are voting illegally or have voter fraud schemes, which may encompass other non-citizen voters, they're doing this to affect the election. Everybody who casts a vote legally or fraudulently are looking to affect the election. So this idea that, oh, it didn't affect the outcome, it doesn't matter. Of course it matters. The intent was to affect the election. So anybody who commits voter fraud, it's a very serious crime. And if they're here, if they're a foreign national that are here legally, they should be deported. Like I said, even if you're here legally, that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. You're here at the pleasure of the United States government. And you know, it's a little bit of a slow news day today, and I always wonder why, especially going into a weekend, because Friday is the big news day. You know, for items that people will talk, maybe they're holding stuff for tomorrow. Maybe there's something big coming. There certainly will be as far as economics are concerned. But if anybody does have concern with economics, they should wait 6 months. We need to see where we are in 6 months, and then you can because that's really when Trump's going to affect economics, because it's going to be about a month until the tariff starts affecting everyday people. But most of what Trump has done in office so far isn't affecting anybody's personal financial situation. Post Millennials reporting Tesla arson suspect released as judge cites DHD, lack of gender-affirming care, in jail. Owen McIntyre was arrested earlier this month in connection with a March incident in which a Molotov cocktail was thrown at a Kansas City Tesla dealership. It's terrorism. If you commit acts of violence or destruction with the motive of some sort of political outcome, it's terrorism. The 19-year-old suspect accused of setting fire to a Tesla dealership in Kansas City has been released from federal custody. That was kind of a mind fuck there. After a judge cited the individual's ADHD diagnosis and limited access to gender-affirming care and detention as factors in his decision. It's got to be a liberal judge. Why would you release people from prison? Owen McIntyre, resident of Parksville, Missouri, was arrested earlier this month in Boston. The attack caused damage to 2 Tesla Cybertrucks, but did not result in any injuries. Despite the seriousness of the charge, federal judge last week approved McIntyre's release, and that continued detention would disrupt serious ongoing medical treatment. I guess that's his gender-affirming care, including care for depression and gender-affirming services. The defense also emphasized that McIntyre had no prior criminal history and was unlikely to pose a flight risk. But he had been motivated by what was reported on the news to attack, and by the Democratic National Party. These are the brown shirts of the Democrats that at any time can be activated to cause harm, assassination, in the case of the United Healthcare CEO, or, riots, damage, etc. Just the News is reporting schools hiding gender transition from parents harm kids. Transgender psychologist tells judges there was a hearing. Youth social transition is a major and potentially life-altering decision and not the best approach for all children experience gender incongruence or gender dysphoria. Now they call it incongruence. Former U.S. Professional Association for Transgender Health President Erica Anderson, who primarily treats gender-confused kids, said in a joint brief with 2 public interest law firms, such children should receive a careful professional assessment. Parents must be involved and must ultimately decide what is best for their child. Indeed. In pushing kids who have gender dysphoria further into their dysphoria, doesn't help people. Now we got an article here from Zero Hedge, extremely bad breach of ethics. Elon Musk blasts the Wall Street Journal CEO search report. So if you didn't see, Tesla chairwoman Robin Denholm denied the Wall Street Journal report, claiming the board had begun searching for Elon Musk's successor, calling the story absolutely false. Musk echoed the rebuke, slamming the story as extremely bad breach of ethics, without a doubt. Reuters also is reporting late rally propels Dow SP 500 to slight gains. Quarter 1 GDP contracts at 0.3% rate. SMCI plunges after Q3 forecast cut. Caterpillar ends higher after choppy trading result session. And the rest, the Dow up 0.35, S&P 500 up 0.15, NASDAQ was down. So most of these results are mixed. We're going to have mixed results until we get some tariff deal signed and there's a clear economic picture. I mean, Trump is trying to move this as fast as he can. It's hard to think that this is going to last more than 6 months, but 6 months is an eternity in the markets. Some good news, though. Reuters reports Ukraine-U.S. signed minerals deal sought by Trump. Deal positions 2 countries to boost Ukraine's recovery. Ukraine official says U.S. may provide new assistance. Signing follows months of negotiations, frayed ties. Ukraine officials say Kiev decides where to mine. But now there's the Ukraine, the Ukraine came to sign the deal and then there was more paperwork and then they weren't sure about it. So now it's in limbo once again. All right, looking at China, the BBC, we don't care. Defiant China looks beyond Trump's America. So the people that produce the cheap shit, factories and markets, businessmen and exporters now say they have other alternatives beyond Trump's America. Mr. Yu, for instance, says around 20-30% of his business came from U.S. buyers, but not anymore. Excuse me, and before I get into that, Next article. China produces shit for the most part. Most people buy shit that is poorly made from China. If they paid for the Americans or even Mexicans to make it, it would be way more expensive. The thing is, Americans like to buy shit. They like to buy a lot of cheap shit. And that's what comes from China. Now, if you're buying basic things, you could find that if you're buying like metal boxes or something, that you're going to get, they're cheaper from China than anywhere else. But this article from the BBC mostly talks about the cheap, it's talking to a toy maker. So it's all the cheap crap that has injury risks. It's always Chinese goods that has lead paint or buttons that pop off and could choke your child and everything. So if people want that, go crazy. But you're going to have to pay more for it now. The other article I was going into, China deploys growing army of pro-Beijing NGOs to UN to target critics, is that they often do. They put together all sorts of Chinese, it's really state programs, people, whether it's NGOs, they say we're not affiliated with the Chinese Communist Party or the government, but that's what we do. And so they took a lesson from the United States and, these non-governmental, organizations, you could say in air quotes, because they're funded by the government and most likely have government people in there. Whether, as far as the U.S., whether they're spies for the CIA or, in the terms of China, they're spies for the Communist Party. ICIJ found that the number of Chinese NGOs holding consultative status with the UN has nearly doubled since 2018. China has sought greater influence within the UN human rights system and has become more aggressive in silencing dissent, of course, because communist China is a closed country. So reporters just can't go in there and look around, right? So there have been all sorts of accusations of minorities being rounded up, put in labor camps, and people have to deal with that. People think that China is just another country. Don't hate on the Chinese. And, the Chinese are not very diverse. And the Mandarins and the Han, they're not really interested in having diverse populations. They round up the Uyghurs and they put them in work camps. If most people really knew what was happening in China, they wouldn't want their cheap goods made there anyway. It just goes on to say the NGOs are not independent but closely connected to the Chinese Communist Party, is what I said. The ICIG referred to these Beijing-backed NGOs as GEO-NGOs, government-organized non-governmental organizations, of course, because everything is run by the Communist Party in China. It's a one-party system. The same thing that the leftists would want in this country. One American News, Chinese officials claim COVID-19 might have emerged in the U.S., not in a Wuhan lab. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that is true. We certainly know that the early chimeric viruses based on the coronavirus or a nouveau or a new coronavirus, novel, were first developed at Chapel Hill with Chinese Communist scientists and were likely smuggled out of Canada's level 4 lab. I think it was in Saskatchewan. But the early corona chimeric viruses were developed here in the United States, how they got to China, were they released in the United States prior? Because there were people here that were sick with the coronavirus in the fall and early winter of 2019. I think I even had it. But we don't know how it got here. Did it come from China earlier? I believe that the outbreak and all the tracing points to an outbreak that happened in late August, early September of 2019 in China. You know, it could be plausible deniability because the Chinese BSL-4 labs were known for being lackadaisical in biosecurity. And so is that plausible deniability? You release it outside the Wuhan lab to get the ball rolling, and then you just blame the lab for the leak. Plausible deniability. Unintentional leak versus intentional release. So you had several layers of plausible deniability. Like it came from a wet market, or it or it came from a bat in the jungle or a pangolin or whatever. Story goes on to say that Beijing claims that the COVID-19 pandemic, which brought global society to a standstill, the virus, which the Center of Disease Control and the World Health Organization claims took the lives of 7 million people, may have originated in the United States. The document seems to direct response to Trump administration's intensified assertions regarding the Wuhan lab. Well, all right, moving along. Harris draws social media scorn for her digression about elephants during an earthquake. She's an idiot. Please allow me, friends, she said, to digress for a moment. Okay, it's kind of dark in here, but I'm looking for a show of hands, blah, blah. You know, she sucks. I don't even know. And then New York Post has a similar article. Her vision for America. Google it. And then she goes into this diatribe about people that like to incite fear. That's the Democrats, really. Divide and conquer, that's the Democrats. Again, they're pointing back to themselves. Americans across the political spectrum who are declaring that the president reckless tariffs hurt workers and families by raising costs of everyday essentials. That's not true. Everyday essentials are not affected by tariffs unless you buy cheap shit from China. Clothes at Walmart, crap at Walmart, etc. But your toothpaste isn't manufactured in China. Reuters reports U.S. Senate rejects bill to rein in Trump's tariffs on economy contracts. The Republicans then called in advance to prevent its reconsideration. So the Democrats here were trying to, move a bill to shut down Trump's tariffs. They don't have the power to do that. That's why 2026 is going to be so important, the midterms. Hunter Biden abruptly drops lawsuit against IRS. This is the New York Post. A move the whistleblowers say that shows everything you need to know. Obviously, the two whistleblowers, Gary Shapley, who was an IRS supervisory special agent, and Joe Ziegler, who was an agent, they blew the whistle on Hunter Biden and said he was getting consideration from the White House and the DOJ, and they didn't prosecute him, even though he blatantly avoided paying his taxes. So Axios says some breaking news. White House launches Drudge-style website to promote Trump. The site is called White House Wire. And like many things Trump, it's just involved in reporting things in the way Trump wants to see them reported. I would say more accurately than the mainstream news. I mean, we saw that interview on ABC with Trump. That guy fucking sucked. I mean, of all the questions he could ask to rely, or not just rely, or to stay on the subject of which Democrats like, is to remain there and constantly ask questions about Abrego Garcia and whether he was deported or whether he should come back. But there are a lot of other things going on that he could have asked about. More news from the Wall Street Journal. U.S. plans massive increase in its use of drones. The shift to more small unmanned aircraft is based on lessons from the Ukraine battlefield, of course, because that's where we were developing the new robot warfare. As we often do, we start wars to test out new technology. But one war we hadn't counted on, just the news is reporting India and Pakistan are both armed with nuclear weapons and on the brink of war after the Kashmir attack. India closed its airspace to Pakistani aircraft on Wednesday. And then the defense minister of Pakistan announcing he had taken steps to prepare for an Indian attack. There's a lot of religious animosity between the two countries, which were all India at one point, and then you had the separation after World War II. Zero Hedge is reporting British Royal Marine held under Terrorism Act for questioning DEI policies. It's disturbing and not surprising that the British government is now holding soldiers under the Terrorism Act for questioning the idea of women in combat. The Telegraph's highly unusual move publicly warned about lowering the standards. This Royal Marine publicly warned about lowering the standards for female trainees. The commando said that about 1,000 of his fellow Marines backed a private letter to military chiefs raising fears of what so-called diversity, equality, and inclusion, it's equity actually, policies were in danger of creating an unrecognizable, weak, and compromised version of the Corps. That women were artificially pushed through training. And given the British government's cult-like obsession with far-left ideology, the imposition of DEI will probably be unstoppable and catastrophic for the fighting forces. Indeed. How can you get a hold on somebody under terrorism charges for saying that a certain policy may affect combat readiness? We're going to end up with a national review, our urgent birth rate problem. The compounding effect of lower fertility over generations means we can already expect the future to be lonelier for many people who have much smaller and thinner family trees. The increasing suicide rates of the elderly and rapidly aging Japan and South Korea are an ominous sign. Clearly, the normal course of human life and the passing of generations benefit the entire family. And that's all she wrote for today. Thanks for joining me today. Don't forget to engage the channel, like, subscribe, leave a comment, share the podcast. It is May Day for all you communists out there. Remember, you're under attack psychologically and biologically. Stay hip to that trick. I have to apologize for not getting an episode of Tuesdays with Perry. It turns out I thought I had food poisoning, and I thought it was, bacterial, regular type of food poisoning. It turns out it's more along the lines of a toxicity. So I was literally poisoned, that it wasn't organic stomach virus or bacteria or something. And it's still affecting me. People are out to get to me, dealing with hacks all the time. And, you go out to eat, you don't know who's preparing your food or whether they know who you are. Maybe they just don't like you or what you order or whatever. Anyway, thanks for joining me today. I'll see you tomorrow. Stay hip to the trick. Respect.
You can't handle the truth.
This is a conspiracy.
The New World Order. The New World Order.
I'm an American. I have rights.